Medical Interpreter Code of Ethics, Medio IGC 101, Unit 2. So you already know me, Dr. Isabel Souza, your presenter for this unit as well. I've already shared my bio with you on the first unit, so we can go on to the next slide. So today we're going to give you a little bit of a background on the Code of Ethics. The basic purpose of a Code of Ethics is certainly for us to have the rules and guidelines on how to act in our profession. This is incredibly important, and a Code of Ethics is vital for a profession. Actually, it's not a profession without a Code of Ethics, and what it shows is that we have to make decisions in our work, and they may have repercussions for others. So every profession has their own Code of Ethics, and we have ours. It guides all our actions. And Medio has really looked at an enormous amount of Code of Ethics. A lot of healthcare organizations create their own codes. National and international associations have a Code of Ethics. And they all seem to have the same areas of concern. So we're going to go, we've kind of distilled that, and we'll go through the different areas that are included in every single Code of Ethics. So let's go on to the first tenet. We call these ethical tenets or ethical rules. And the next slide will tell you that we're going to go back to the topic of confidentiality. On the next slide. What's the definition of confidentiality? Not disclosing information. Why is it important? There's so many reasons, but first of all, it deals with a much higher ethical rule of respecting the patient's right to privacy. It can be quite embarrassing for patients for others to know of their medical situations. It's also important for us as interpreting professionals because we need to gain the trust of all the parties involved. So if a patient looks at us and is afraid that we're going to use that information in any way, that patient will not feel comfortable sharing. So it's important that we let them know that everything that they communicate is confidential, and that increases their trust. So it is important because we need to have the trust of all the parties we work with. Examples of issues with confidentiality usually happen when, it can happen either way. Either patients and providers don't want us to share something, but we've already stated that everything that is interpreted will be shared in that session only. But it also happens when, we feel the need to share something and we're not sure if we should or shouldn't. Again, whenever we feel that need, we need to discuss it with the provider. We've already discussed some of the legally mandated exceptions. When patients discuss harm to self or others, we're mandated by law to expose that, and we typically will relay it to the provider. And, there are some other gray areas, and I'll give you an example. Let's just say you were in a session and there was, really overt discrimination against the patient, and you want to discuss it with your supervisor. You can discuss that without naming names, but eventually the supervisor may want to know, well, who was the perpetrator of this behavior? We need to be able to address it. So you'll be sharing let's say you'll share a provider's information, but you're not sharing the medical information of the case. I have seen interpreters go to court and uphold their ethical rule to confidentiality, and when they're being asked, well, what was stated in the session, the interpreter says, my profession requires me to maintain all interpreted information confidential. So, when in a gray area, always err on the side of caution. So let's go now to the next tenet, and that is accuracy. It is incredibly important that interpreters commit to the ethical rule of interpreting accurately and completely everything that is communicated. Why is that? Well, can you imagine an interpreter who sort of haphazardly shares half of the information? Can you imagine all the problems that could ensue? The whole point of us being present in a session is so that communication can be accurate. So it's a very practical rule. It's something that grounds us. It's really our main purpose to interpret accurately and completely. And when we say completely, of course, we mean not omitting anything, but we also mean interpreting the spirit of the message, the intent, as we could, observe it in the patient's tone or the provider's way of speaking. So accuracy doesn't just mean, accurately interpreting phrases or signs. It actually means interpreting everything. So our choice of language is key. And there are many ways to express the same meaning. So we try to find the expression that is closest to what was intended. And if we're not sure what was intended, we may even need to ask. But accuracy goes beyond, finding the correct words, if you will. So we've talked about confidentiality, accuracy. Let's go on to the next slide. And you're going to, I'm going to talk a little bit more about completeness. Completeness means all comments are interpreted. How can I give you an example? Repetitions or hesitations. If an interpreter says, no, if a patient, says, no, that didn't happen, then you're going to interpret exactly as you heard. You're going to interpret all those repetitions. No. So even though we're interpreting meaning, we're also interpreting all of those units of meaning. And when you think of exceptions to the rule, I'll give you a cultural exception. Let's just say you're interpreting for a situation where the family is expecting the news from the provider, and the provider has bad news, and the provider wants to say how sorry he is that the patient passed. The interpreter in that situation alerts the provider, tells the family, I need to ask for clarification here, goes, speaks to the provider and says, I cannot interpret it as you're stating it, because when you say you're sorry in the Navajo language, it means that you're making yourself responsible for it. There's a sense of responsibility that comes with that term in our language. So maybe you can say you're sad or you're upset, but you don't want to say you're sorry, because that's what it means in our language. So in this case, it was a cultural intervention, and that particular unit of meaning was interpreted as intended. He didn't mean to say he was responsible for her death. He meant to say he felt bad for her death. So again, there are different ways to do this. Some interpreters may simply change it to a culturally appropriate language, and some may wish to stop. Or perhaps if a provider or a patient says something very rude, there are interpreters that will stop and say, is this what you want me to interpret? Asking for clarification and indirectly giving that person the opportunity to rephrase. But completeness is very important, because again, you can't have transparency if you're not interpreting everything and you're not interpreting it all correctly and accurately. So let's go on to the next point. Conveying cultural frameworks. I certainly just gave you an example. And we have to remember that language and culture are completely intertwined. When we communicate an idea, that idea may have a cultural framework that we assume everybody knows. And that's because everybody around us knows that framework. However, when you're explaining that unit of meaning, that concept into another language, that other language may not have that context. So oftentimes there's miscommunication because of this. So we may have to explain the cultural framework. I'll give you an example. A patient is with an obstetrician, and the patient says, "I want my baby, to be born on this date." And the provider says, "Well, the baby should be born, within 2 weeks of this date." And then the patient says, "No, I want the baby to be born on this date." And then the provider says, "Well, we can't predict the date that the baby will be born. The baby, within 2 weeks of this date, before or even after." And then the patient just keeps repeating, "But I want the baby to be born on this date." Now, in this scenario, this is a Brazilian patient who has had other children and has always selected the date of birth of her child. And that is because in Brazil, most babies are born with set dates. So the provider is not quite understanding what she means when she says, "I want the baby to be born on this date." So after a few repetitions, the interpreter got the idea that perhaps this is what the patient meant. So the interpreter asks for a clarification, says, "Are you asking for the baby to be born on this date because you want a C-section and you want to schedule the birth for this date? Is that what you're trying to explain?" And the patient goes, "Of course. That's what I mean." And then said, "Do you want to explain this to the provider?" So the patient might explain it, or the patient might look at you like, "No, no, no, you explain it." And then the interpreter, in that case, would explain that cultural framework to the provider, to which the provider would have an aha moment and go, "Oh, that's what you mean. Well, in this practice," and then the provider would say whatever he decided to say. So, um, when a communication is not moving forward because there is some idea or concept that is simply not being understood, then it's important um, for for us to intervene. I'll give you just one more example. In a nutrition case, this patient is diabetic. The sugar levels are just not going down, and the provider just can't understand, what is it that you're eating? What do you drink? "I have orange juice." Well, that it could be it, but not enough for your sugar level. Well, maybe that patient happens to be from Haiti, and in Haiti, it used to be common to put sugar in the orange juice. So the interpreter asks the patient, "Do you put sugar in your orange juice?" And the patient responds, "Yes, of course." And as you can see, then the communication can occur, because when they say, "I drink orange juice," what they mean is, "I drink orange juice with sugar," and not just, "I drink orange juice." So what we say and what we mean can have small variations that are culturally based. So we'll discuss this more in the future, but conveying cultural frameworks is important in the sense of enabling that communication. So let's move on to the next slide. And this might be the last one. So for now, we're going to end it here, and then we'll continue on Unit 3. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.